So welcome everyone. So we will resume our study. So let me begin with a short prayer. Om Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amrutam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So on the first class that we had, we saw the preparatory disciplines necessary for the study of Vedanta. Then yesterday, we saw the distinction between the different parts of our personality. The distinction between what Vivekachudamani says, me and that, aham and tat. We saw that as we understand ourselves at present, we see that there are layers of different aspects within our personality. The outermost layer is what we call the sthula sharira, the gross body. Within that is the subtle body, the sukshma sharira, and within that is the causal body, the karan sharira. We saw what these three bodies were yesterday. We also saw that it's possible to divide our personality in 5 layers instead of 3 bodies. So just different ways of classifying the layers which cover. And within them all is the Atman, which is the only non-material part of our personality. There is a beautiful verse on, look at verse number 211, which gives a nice description of the Atman. That's on page 92 of your books. This is how it goes. Yoyam Atma Swayam Jyotihi Panchakosha Vilakshanaha Avastha Traya Sakshi San Nirvikaro Niranjanaha Sadananda Savidneyaha Swatmatvena Vipaschita. This Atman, who is self-effulgent, distinct from the 5 layers, the 5 koshas we spoke about, the witness of the 3 states, we spoke about this also yesterday, real, as opposed to only an appearance, unchanging, without impurity, and eternally blissful, should be known by the discerning to be their own self. So what we will do today is try to see how I and that reality are one and the same, because that is the teaching that the teacher gives. He tells the student, Tat Tvam Asi, you are that. And that we have seen, this the words that we read just now, is real, is non-material, is infinite, is different from these 3 bodies, different from the 3 states, different from the 5 layers, and it's Swayam Jyoti, self-effulgent, doesn't depend on anything. As opposed to all these other things, the 5 layers, the sthula sharir, the sukshma sharir, the karan sharir, the avidya, that they are so different from one another as opposed to one another as light and darkness are. So if someone were to say light is darkness, then it wouldn't make sense because they are completely opposite things. So saying that I am this infinite one is as paradoxical. And so what is the meaning of Tat Tvam Asi, you are that? So before we go there is a lot of discussion about why do mistakes occur? Why is it that we mistake one thing for another? We know that in Vedanta, the classical example often given is that of a rope, which is mistaken for a snake. So the question that often gets asked is, why does this mistake occur? If you enter a room in which there is no sufficient light and there is a coiled rope on the ground, sometimes we may think, oh, there is a snake here, and we might be frightened. So why do we see the snake? From where does that snake come? Now, there are many theories about it. Many different great thinkers have tried to explain why we mistake one thing for another. This mistaking one thing for another is in Sanskrit called superimposition, or projecting one thing over another. And that is the word for that is called adhyasa or adhyaropa. So I won't go into these many theories about why that mysterious snake is seen. But if you are interested in knowing those theories, if you go to the Boston website, we have a section called the blog. In fact, the most recent blog is exactly on this subject, about why we mistake a rope for a snake and what are the different theories about why this error occurs. So I will just tell you the conclusion of that. The Vedanta feels that the nature of the snake is mysterious. You cannot say the snake is there, because when you switch on the light, you find it's just a rope. You cannot say that the snake is not there, because if it's not there, how am I seeing it? So you cannot say it is there. You cannot say it is not there. You cannot say it is there and not there. You cannot say it is not there and not there. You really cannot say anything about it. And therefore, it is what in Sanskrit they say, anirvachaniya. Anirvachaniya means you cannot express the status of the snake. Now, there is a word that they have for that, and that's called mithya. So there are these two terms, real. The word for real in Sanskrit is sat. That which is unreal, it's called asat. So sat, asat, complete opposites. Now this mysterious nature of the snake, or mysterious nature of things which we see for a while, which appear real for a while, and then suddenly they are no longer real. Our dream, for instance, as long as we are dreaming, the dreams are very real. And then suddenly, when we wake up in the morning, the whole dream vanishes. So what is do we say the dreams are real or unreal? We cannot say they are totally unreal, because otherwise, how are we seeing it? We cannot say they are real either. So something that is neither this nor that, we say is mithya. That is, in Sanskrit, they say, yat asat bhasamanam, that which is unreal, but which appears to be real. So the nature of the world that we live in, the world that we experience, we cannot say the world is unreal, because, well, of course, we are seeing it. We are living in it. All our lives are spent here. But what we can say is the world is an appearance. Just like the dreams are an appearance, this world is also an appearance. There is a long discussion in Vedanta about the similarity between the waking experience and the dream experience. And if we think about it a little bit deeply, we'll see that there are really no differences. And as I mentioned yesterday, I think that just as it is possible to say that there are these three states, waking, dream, and deep sleep, it is just as possible to say that there are three kinds of dreams. All the three can be seen as dreams. So mistaking one thing for another occurs because of ignorance. When I enter the room in which that rope is there, if I know it's a rope, I'm never going to think it's a snake. I don't know it's a rope, so I have ajnana about the rope. My ignorance of the rope produces the snake. So ignorance has two powers. One is called the avarana shakti, And the other power is called Vikshepa Shakti. Avarana Shakti means the power to cover, the power to hide. And Vikshepa Shakti means the power to project. So what the ignorance of the rope does is it covers the rope, and in its place, a snake is projected. Exactly in the same way, we are all divine beings. We are the infinite beings. But my infinitude, my perfection, my freedom is covered by this Avarana Shakti, this concealing power of ignorance. And on top of that, a human being is projected. So just as a rope is mistaken for a snake, the divine being is mistaken for a human being. So we are not human beings trying to become divine. We are divine beings who are deluded into thinking that we are human. And so what this book does is it takes up this statement, this great Mahavakya, Tattvamasi, and tries to understand its meaning. And as I said, when we are told you are that infinite being, it makes no sense because it's just not true. It feels it's not true. Now, if a crazy person, a deluded person were to come and say something which is totally nonsensical, then we wouldn't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Oh, this must be some great philosophy. We just laugh it off and say, oh, this is just a foolish person saying something. But when the Vedic rishis, they come and say something, then we have to pause and say, no, even if this doesn't make sense right now, even if it might appear very crazy and foolish, I might still have to pause and say, this person who is saying it is a wise person. This person won't say anything foolish. So maybe I'm not understanding the meaning of what is said. So when the literal meaning does not make sense, then we go to its implied meaning. So the word for that is called lakshana. That is, what is the method for finding an implied meaning? And sometimes we know, a lot of times we say things in life which we don't mean literally. Sometimes maybe we are angry sometimes, and sometimes people have the habit of saying, I wish you were dead. Now, they don't really mean it like that. What they are really saying is, I'm so mad at you, I don't want to look at you. Again, even when people say, I don't even want to see your face, they're not meaning it literally. They're just showing their anger. So, and actually, we know an example is already there in the Kathopanishad, when some of you may have read this book and studied it. We know how this young boy, Nachiketa, his father was this great king, and he had made this great a ritual, which requires that at the end of that ritual, when you acquire a lot of punya, a lot of merit, but that ritual required that you give away everything of value in charity. Then you will go to Swarga, you'll go to heaven and all of that. So he was doing all that, but was not really following the rules of that ritual properly. He was not really giving away everything valuable. And what the Upanishad says is, instead of giving away all his valuable things, he was giving away all the useless things, the things that he didn't need. Now we have to understand that when we give away things in charity and hope that this is a great meritorious acts, are we only giving away things that are useless? That instead of throwing away something in trash, I'm giving it in charity, or something that is useful to me, valuable to me, but I recognize that someone else's need is greater than mine. So anyway, in this case, this young boy, Nachiketa, found that his father was kind of cheating, not giving away the really valuable things. So he was not the 21st century kid who could have just gone and asked his father, "You're cheating, you're wrong," would have said like that. But Nachiketa belonged to a different generation. And so instead of directly telling his father, he found a more subtle way of doing it. So he went and asked his father, "Whom are you going to give me? Because I think I'm your son and you value me. And so where will you give me?" And his father is so angry that what does this son think of himself? He's trying to be very cheeky, trying to be too smart. And so father is so angry and he says, "I give you to death." In other words, I wanted to die. Now, Nachiketa took it literally and he actually went to death. And of course, his father was mortified because his father didn't want him to go away. So this is just one example, and there are many such we'll find even in our daily lives. Sometimes people say, "I'm so busy, I have no time to breathe." Of course, everyone has time to breathe. Otherwise, they wouldn't live. So there are such statements where literal meaning does not make sense. So we go to the implied meaning. Now, there are three kinds, at least, of implied meanings are possible to extract, or three ways of deriving meaning from statements that don't make sense. So I won't go into too much detail, but I think it's very helpful to know. And I'll also tell you the classical examples about it. So one kind of distinguishing between literal and implied meaning it's called Jahat Lakshana. That means whatever is said, you reject the literal part of it and substitute it by something else. And in ancient books, they give the example. For instance, there is this phrase in Sanskrit, Gangayam Ghoshaha, which really means a village of cowherds on the Ganges, in the Ganges. Literally translated, it means the village in the Ganges, in the Ganga. Now, there is no village in the Ganga. What is really meant is, it is on the bank of the river Ganga. But sometimes people say, my house is on, for instance, we can say the Ashrama here in Boston. Oh, it's on River Charles. But the Charles is just flowing by here, just outside my window. But it's really not literally on the River Charles. What I mean is it's on the bank of the River Charles. So this is one example of a literal meaning being rejected. So in the river is substituted by on the river or on the bank of the river. So that's for one example. The second example is sometimes called Ajahat Lakshana, in which you don't reject any part of the statement, but you add something else to make sense of it. And one way of describing that would be, suppose it's an extremely rainy day and people have all gathered for some big function or a game or something, and everyone has brought umbrellas. And of course, everyone's holding umbrellas because it's raining. And now, after that, if someone says, "Oh, I went to see that game and there were thousands of umbrellas there," which is true, but the umbrellas didn't go by themselves. There were people under the umbrellas. So when we say the place was filled with umbrellas, so literally what is really implied meaning is that there were hundreds of thousands of people gathered there and everyone was holding the umbrella. So that's a second way of deriving the implication and not taking the literal meaning. And a third kind of distinction between a literal and implied is what in Sanskrit they say, Jahat Ajahat Lakshana. Now, all these three are described in this book. That's why I'm not going to the verses themselves, but you will find it when you read the book. So the third example that is given is that suppose there is this one person and the name they often use is Devadatta. So I don't think there's nowadays people, modern names, I don't know whether you know any of your acquaintances are named Devadatta, but in Sanskrit, In old books, this name comes up very often. So the idea is, suppose you meet a person called Devadatta, and you met that person in New York, say 10 years ago. And then this person is visiting Pittsburgh after 10 years. And then this person now shows up, and of course, 10 years, a lot has changed. This person has become older. That time he was just a student, and now this person is older, wearing a different kind of dress, has grown a beard or something, and become taller. And so first you don't recognize him. He said, "Hello, who are you? Have you met?" And then this person said, "Oh, didn't you remember? 10 years ago, we met in New York." They said, "Oh, you are that Devadatta whom I met in New York." So this statement, "you are that Devadatta," in Sanskrit means Soyam Devadattaha. So Ayam Saha Ayam Devadattaha. So now that Devadatta I met in New York 10 years ago was a 18-year-old teenager, was shorter, thinner, and now 10 years later, I meet this Devadatta who is taller, who's put on some weight, whose appearance has changed. And how can these two people be the same? Because the appearance has changed, the height has changed, the voice has changed, a lot of changes have occurred. And yet I say, no, this is the same person. What is meant is that whatever changes have occurred in the non-essential details of that person. So the height of the person, now your and my identity is not based on our weight, because when we were born, we weighed only a few pounds. Now we weigh much more. So we are not a different person. If I line up all the photographs of mine taken from my childhood up to now, I probably look different in all of those photographs. And yet I know those are photographs of the same person. So what we are essentially doing here is we are seeing that our height, weight, appearance, our voice, all these characteristics are not the essential characteristics of who we are. That in spite of all these physical and mental changes, I'm still the same person. Exactly in the same way, when this statement, Tat Tvam Asi, you are that. So you, as a human being, with this body, mind, mortal, born at some point, going to die some point at some point, and with limited human capabilities. And that is Ishvara, who is infinite, who is the controller of Maya, who is much, much more powerful than you and me. How can the two be same? And exactly as the example I gave you about what Vedanta teachers say is, if I, just as my form, my power, my lifespan are not essential characteristics of me, that even though these things change, I'm still the same person, they are not the essential characteristics of God as well, of Ishvara as well. So yes, Vaikuntha may be, Vishnu may be staying in Vaikuntha, I may be staying in Boston or Pittsburgh or wherever. Vishnu looks different, I look different, but all of these external differences, if they are removed, the reality within me and the reality within Ishvara is one and the same. Sometimes we might remember, take for instance, at the time of Durga Puja, for instance. So there are, at the time of Durga Puja, when worship is done in an image, then of course there is Ma Durga, and oftentimes in a traditional images, there is Ma Saraswati, Ma Lakshmi, then there is Ganesh, there is Kartik, there is a Mahishasura, there is the lion, and you know, there's a whole lot of things. Now, all of them When traditionally they are made of clay. So as clay, when you go and immerse that image in the Ganga or in the sea or wherever you image, ultimately, if all those ornaments and color and forms, everything are dissolved, only the clay remains. And then you can never distinguish whether this clay came from the Mahishasura's form or from Mother Durga's form. So as clay, there is no difference. They are all one and the same. But in the form, Mahishasur can never become Ma Durga. Ganesh can never become Kartik. So with the form, they are different. But the reality within them, the clay within them, they are all same. Just think about the jewelry that people have. So the different ornaments, gold ornaments. Now, earrings have to be put in the ear. The different kind of ornaments have different places on which we can use them. We can't put an earring on our wrist and vice versa. Well, maybe what is on your wrist, maybe sometimes you can have a larger here. So just as we cannot exchange one ornament for another, each ornament has its specific place to put. But if you melt them, and if they are all gold ornaments, as gold, they are one and the same. So similarly, the distinction between Jiva, Jivatma and Paramatma. Now you see at the end of both of these words, Atma is there. Jivatma and Paramatma. So now, what is it that makes this Atma a Jiva? And what is it that makes that Atma the Supreme Atma, Param Atma? Just the difference in this lifespan, the power, the form, the glory. Now, none of those are essential characteristics of them. So if those are removed, those are eliminated, and you retain the essential characteristic, which is consciousness, which is purity, which is the Atman. The Atman in you and me, and the Atman inside Shiva, Vishnu, Devi, the Atman is not different. The Atman is one and the same. It's the externalities that are different. And so that is the meaning of the statement, Tat Tvamasi, you are that. Now, superficially, as I said, if you take the literal meaning, makes no sense. But if you look deeply and then ask, if I look deeply within me, what do I see? I see these three bodies. I see these 5 layers. And within that layer, I see this shining reality in my heart. And then I look deeply at the deity I worship. And within that deity, again, the deity is not simply a form. Every avatar has a historical dimension and a transcendent dimension. So Sri Ramakrishna, in the historical dimension, was born in 1836, and his body passed away in 1886. Now, if that was the essential, if the body of Ramakrishna was the essential characteristic of Ramakrishna, then he's not there here anymore. We can't even see him. But we know that devotees have had darshan of Sri Ramakrishna, have been blessed by him, have received his grace. So it means that his body was not the essential characteristic. So it's not like Ramakrishna minus the body is not like total Ramakrishna then. So the real Ramakrishna is one who is inside that body, inside that mind. And that is what he meant when he said, he who was Rama, he who was Krishna is now Ramakrishna in this body. What is meant is that the reality within Rama, the reality within Krishna, the reality within Ramakrishna are one and the same. And that is the kind of realization that we must have eventually. And that is when we will be able to transcend all the limitations within our heart. So what this book does, if you look at verses 254 to 263, very beautiful 10 verses, when the teacher offers a meditation on Brahman. Look at verse 254 as an example. That's on page 112. Jati niti kulagotra duragam nama rupa gunadosha varjitam desha kala vishayati vartiyat brahma tattvamasi bhavaya atmani. Contemplate in your heart that you are Brahman, who is beyond caste, creed, family, and lineage, is free from name, form, qualities, and defects, and transcends place, time, and sense objects. So all of these following 10 verses end with this statement, Brahma tattvamasi, tattvam asi, bhavaya atmani. Contemplate in your heart that you are Brahman, is verse 255, who is supreme, beyond the reach of all senses, within reach of one with purified understanding, the embodiment of pure awareness, and eternal. 256, contemplate in your heart that you are Brahman, who is untouched by the 6 waves. The 6 waves are hunger and thirst, grief and delusion, decay and death. Contemplated in a yogi's heart, not revealed by the senses, not known by the intellect, and flawlessly perfect. So you can go up to verse number 263, and you will see it's a very powerful meditation on Brahman. Even reading these verses once a day can remind us of the kind of things we tend to forget in daily life. And this book, Vivekachudamani, is filled with such very inspiring shlokas which we can reflect on, which we can meditate on. And the primary obstacle to understanding this reality, the primary obstacle in realizing the truth, in realizing God, as Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swami Ji, they have pointed out again and again, is the ego, ahankara. Sri Ramakrishna in Bengali, there is a phrase which he was fond of saying. He used to say, Ami morle ghuchibe janjal. When this ahankara dies, then all the problems end. All problems start with I. We know that when we are in deep sleep, when this I is completely absent, nobody has any problems in deep sleep. This I is gone. But this I comes up in the dream and also in the waking state, and all these problems about, this happened in my past, or this may happen in my future. So I and mine is a major, major obstacle. You will find this beautifully described in, look at, for instance, verse number 298. That is on page 129. Satyanye pratibandha pumsaha samsara hetavo drishtaha teshameva moolam prathama vikaro bhavati ahankaraha. There are other obstacles that lead to a person's being in samsara. At their root, this is most important, the root of all obstacles is egoism, which is the first modification of ignorance. Now, what is the meaning of first modification of ignorance? As I mentioned briefly yesterday, when we are born, when you're just little babies, just a few days old, we don't have that sense of I immediately. A little baby who is a few hours or a few days old does not know where her body ends and the rest of the world begins. It takes a little while for the baby to feel I. Now, this is the great discovery. In fact, sometimes they tell the story in one professor of psychology, when he had a baby, the first time the baby uttered the word I, he gave a big party to all his friends. because this awareness of I is a big landmark in our evolution, because suddenly I am someone. Sometimes when um, there is a story about um, a couple and their little child. The child may have been probably 7 or 8 years old, and they went to a restaurant and to have lunch or dinner or to eat something. So they're sitting there at the restaurant, and then the waiter comes and says, "What would you like to have?" So he asks this man, who's the father, and the father says, "Order something. I want this." Then he asks the mother, "What would you like to have?" And then the mother looks at the menu and says, "This is what you want." And then he looks at this little child and says, "Yes, sir. What would you like to have?" And before the child had any chance to answer, the father gives an answer on his behalf and says, "Oh, get him cereals." And this waiter totally ignores that father and looks at that child and says, "Yes, sir. What would you like to have?" And then the child opens up the menu and says, "Yes, get me this." And then he asks them, "What would you like to drink?" See, the father says, "Get me coffee." And he asks the mother, "What would you like to have?" Mother says, "I will have coffee also." And then he asks the little boy, "Yes, sir, what would you like to have?" And again, before this baby child is answered, the father says, "Oh, get him Horlicks or something, or chocolate." Again, that waiter totally ignores that father and looks at that child and says, "Yes, sir, what would you like to have?" And then this boy feels so important. He just looks at that menu and says, "Yes, I would like to have a coffee also." And then after this waiter leaves, this boy couldn't believe it. He looks at his parents and says, "Daddy, mommy, this waiter thinks I am real." So see, sometimes we do that. Sometimes we make decisions for our children without often recognizing they are someone. They have an identity. They have a voice. They should be allowed to be given a chance to say what they want. And so, and this kind of begins early, as I said, a lot of times in young age, we don't even feel we have any identity at all. But once this I comes, great as this feeling is that I am someone, alongside the knowledge of I comes the knowledge of not I. So if I am this, then everything other than this is not me. And then suddenly it takes a little time to discover, but any smart person will discover that this me is pretty small. This not me, this is not me, this is not me, this is not me, this is not me. The whole world is not me. And this world is so much bigger, so much more powerful than me. So the root of our fear, the root of our vulnerability comes with this I. Because suddenly I discover this I is so less powerful than all this not I, which is so much more powerful. And that's why I, the ego, the ahankara, is at the root of all obstacles. And when that ahankara is transcended, and as Swami Vivekananda said, we can do that through bhakti, through devotion, through knowledge, through following the path Jnana Yoga. We can do it through the path of Karma Yoga or through the path of Raja Yoga. Whichever of these practices we follow, ultimately this false ego, as Sri Ramakrishna would say, this rascal ego is removed. Then we will at once know the meaning of Tat Tvamasi. And at once we will have this realization, Aham Brahmasmi. I am the divine being. I am beyond birth and death. The fear of death will go. The anxiety about illness will go. COVID cannot infect the Atman. COVID can only infect the body and affect the mind also in the process. but it cannot affect the Atman. Once you have realized God, you may not need any masks. You may not need any vaccines. Until then, protect your body, protect your mind. Take all the care necessary. So if you want to be free from this pandemic and all future pandemics, realize God. The easiest way to do that. And a person who has realized God, the last section of this book, if you look at verses 428 through 440, that would be, let's see. That's on page 180. The characteristics of the Jivan Mukta. I'll just read the first verse. 428. Yasya sthita bhavet pradnya yasyanando nirantaraha prapancho visprita prayah sa jivan mukta ishyate. The Jivan Mukta is one whose wisdom is steady, whose joy is unceasing, and who has almost forgotten the universe. So the subsequent verses give the characteristics of the Jivan Mukta, which, as you will notice, are very similar to the characteristics of Sthita Prajna, or the characteristic of the Gunatita, or the characteristic of the Bhakta given in the Bhagavad Gita. So all of these ancient scriptures usually will have a section which describes the characteristics of the enlightened one. And what Shankaracharya points out in his commentaries is that the characteristics of the enlightened one become the disciplines to be practiced by the unenlightened. So what I've tried to do in these 3 classes that we had is to give you a brief outline, the structure of this book, Vivekachudamani. And I would strongly encourage you to read this book. Don't read too much at a time. Just read maybe 2 or 3 verses in a day. Reflect on it. Let the idea sink in you. And you will find that many of the questions and doubts we have about understanding of Vedanta principles, many of those questions will be answered. A lot of the doubts will be removed. So this is one of the best books to understand the Vedanta, not just the theory, but also the practice. And this is the book presently we are studying in Boston on every Wednesday evening at 7:30. So if you are free that time, you can watch it remotely. It's streamed live. So Wednesdays at 7:30, if you go to the Boston website, you will have the link and you will be able to see it. And if you have missed some of the earlier classes can also are also available in the archives. If you want the audio, you can also download it from the Boston website. But if you want to study the book on your own, that's fine also. But this is really a good book. So I would strongly encourage you to read it. It will truly help you in your spiritual life. So if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments,